month marks the 20th anniversary for me since I made my first research trip to England. My first trip to England, full stop. While I was there, I took a bus to northern Gloucestershire in western England and began walking the public footpaths through villages where some of my ancestors had lived for centuries. It was an idyllic introduction to England because the rapeseed and bluebells were in full bloom. This is my photo of the fields that day. Unfortunately, my photo of the bluebells didn't scan so well, so I found this one online, but it looked exactly like that. I was visiting two specific villages, about a mile apart. As I walked the road between those villages, I thought of my great-great-grandmother, Hannah Mariah Ingalls Harris, who was born in one of the villages and who, like her ancestors before her, would have walked that road countless times. Until in early 1841, she and her husband Robert and many of their family and friends and neighbors and co-religionists auctioned their household goods, packed their bags, and sailed to New Orleans on the Nauvoo. Another person who walked that road between Deerhurst and Epperley, Gloucestershire, was Wilford Woodruff. You can actually look at it on page 96. If you Google Epperley on Wilford Woodruff papers, you can see how often he says, I walked to Epperley or to Deerhurst. A small bit of his astounding mission to that region of England. The Norman Places map, done by Professor Brandon Fluke here in the Geography Department of UAM, mapping early branches of the church, shows how quickly the church sprung up in this area. I'm going to zoom into that Three Counties area. You'll recognize Gatineau there in the middle, and Deerhurst and Epperley to the east of Gatineau. And you can see how zoomed in it is because Deerhurst and Epperley are only a mile apart. So, I'm going to talk today about the England of those early converts, the England Wilford Woodruff encountered in 1840. And because I'm largely a historian of the 18th century, you're going to get a lot of the longer history, and not just the 1830s history, of what he encountered when he came. The obvious place to start is the religious landscape, already inhabited by those who had joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And you've heard Ellie talk about some of this. Since 1689, England had allowed Protestants of any flavor to freely worship. And since the Catholic Relief Acts of the 1770s, 90s, and 90s, and the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829, and the later acts in the 1830s, had removed worship and political restrictions placed on Catholics. Paralleling the gradual emancipation of Catholics was the evangelical movement of the latter half of the 1700s and early 1800s. We call its transatlantic cousin the Second Great Awakening. Dissenting or non-conforming Protestants flourished, as did evangelical elements within the Church of England, but not without conflict with the High Church elements that we heard about earlier. Evangelical revivalism, with its focus on personal sanctification and transformation, particularly the version found in Methodism, was widespread by the early 1800s. There were many branches of Methodism, and we've heard about primitive Methodism attract many of the converts in this three-county area where Wilford Woodruff would visit. One group broke off from the primitive Methodists to form the United Brethren, who had dozens of preachers, both men and women, and many gathering places in Gloucestershire, Hereford, and Worcestershire, and a few chapels, including the famous Gatfield Elm. All things most of you, if not all of you, know a lot about. In addition to religious revival, there were also a variety of social reform movements experimenting with new ways of forming community and family across Western Europe, Britain, Ireland, and the United States. Some of these had religious elements, but many were secular. One English group, the Owenites, followers of Robert Owen, formed utopian socialist and communitarian communities. Oh, oops, I forgot I had a slide of John Wesley. Very good. Founder of Methodism and the branches of Methodism here. There we go. Here's my Owen slide. He was considered a communitarian and utopian socialist in some ways, to form new social ways of gathering that they would, based on shared labor and more equality between men and women and between the classes. This is not a real place. This is an artist's rendition of what he imagined in these small, more egalitarian communities. There were also other reform movements and social movements of the late 18th and early 19th century, many of which have been gaining momentum since the early 1700s, such as abolition of slavery, temperance, women's rights, political and labor reform. And you heard about the 1830s Labor Reform Act. So why was there so much interest in this era of rethinking social organization and looking for a religion of personal renewal and spirituality? There are many factors that fed that, and there are literally thousands of books about it. The Reformation, the Enlightenment, Romanticism, dissatisfaction with the established church, particularly around its enormous wealth, the French Revolution, and other factors. I'm going to concentrate on one factor, though it's connected to several others. Industrialization and its associated dislocations and remapping of social and economic relationships. There was a time when we told the story of industrialization, sometimes called the Industrial Revolution, as a series of inventions that increased productivity. However, more recent scholarship has pointed out the importance of increased consumption as driving demand, a consumer and commercial revolution that predated the industrial one. Since the late 1600s, England's expanding empire was sustained by expanding and sophisticated financial and commercial institutions, such as the Bank of England and stock exchanges. They had also experienced an agricultural revolution that meant not only greater crop yields, but more meat per hoof on animals. I only hope the cow really did look like that. It's supposed to be an exaggeration of how great the breeding was, because that body could not walk on those legs. So by the early 19th century, there were also expansive transportation networks that efficiently moved manufactured goods and food around the country and around the empire. The Thames, of course, it's a beautiful painting, and let's say cleaned up what the Thames would really smell or look like, but the Thames, of course, had long been an important in trade and communication for the country and its expanding international empire. The canal system of the 18th century had transformed transportation since 1750, often offering more reliable transport times than many road systems at the time. I just have a couple of slides to show you the growth of the canal system and navigable rivers from 1750, so you can see decade by decade here, 1780, by the time you get to the 19th century, how far you could get around the country on the canal system, which is still functional in England. People live on the canals, and nice little boats. So, this pre-existing network was drastically expanded with the coming of the railway in 1830. The first stretch of railroad in the world between Liverpool and Manchester. That is a depiction from the time of the first trip of that railway. And you can see the dramatic growth of the railroads in the coming decades of the 19th century. Thousands of miles of track were laid over the 19th century, providing England with the most advanced transportation and communication network in the world. To give a sense of the scale of change, just between 1830 and 60, so that's 30 years. Think for yourself how you use your cell phones or the internet in the last 30 years. I bet virtually no one in this room had a cell phone in 1993, and I'm guessing very few of you used the internet or perhaps even knew what it was in 1993. In fall of 1994, I was in the MTC, and I got a letter from a former college roommate who told me she was going to force herself to learn, this is her exact phrase, electronic mail that day. I didn't quite understand what she meant. But by the time I returned home from my mission in 1996, every TV show and commercial listed a .com on the screen. It's not an exact parallel, but I think it can give you a sense of what it was like to live through that kind of technological and communication change. Industrialization brought enormous changes in labor patterns. Oops. I should go back a bit, however, to point out that small-scale and then large-scale manufacturing had long been important to the English economy before the 19th century. Half of the English population was in wage labor by the mid-1600s, but it was mostly seasonal, agricultural, and therefore not enough to survive on. So these couple of illustrative quotes from Steve Hendel wrote this great book called On the Parish, Early Modern English Poor Relief. Paid work was not, therefore, a living in itself, but simply a vital cash supplement to subsistence based on the cultivation of cottage gardens and the exploitation of common rights. Proto-industry was widespread in this context, continuing from Mendel. By the mid-16th century, so mid-1500s, perhaps 1 in 6 adult males and 1 in 3 children and adult women earned their livelihoods from textile production in the cradles of rural industry. So this is a long history of industrialization. This proto-industry, along with the still majority of agricultural work found in smaller farmers and agricultural laborers, preceded industrial and agricultural revolutions and fueled them. One of my favorite accounts from the late 18th and early 19th century comes from a Welshman to describe what this kind of economy meant at the household level. Richard Jones, writing in the 19th century about his childhood in the late 18th century. When faced with starvation after a disastrous harvest, his mother had this conversation with his father. "I'll make a bargain with thee. I'll see to food for us both and the children all winter, if thou, in addition to looking after the horse, the cattle and pigs, will do the churning, wash up, make the bed, and clean the house. I'll make the butter myself." "How wilt thou manage?" asked my father. "I will knit," she said. "We have wool. If thou wilt card it, I'll spin." The bargain was struck. My father did the housework in addition to the work on the farm, and my mother knitted, and so it was she kept us alive until the next year. That, I think, is what proto-industrialization looked like on the ground. Although I really want to know why the butter was hers. She liked her bad butter, so I'm going to do that. You do everything else, and I will knit all winter. I've not mentioned one of the key contributors to the industrial and consumer revolutions yet, and that is population growth. In fact, without the 1750 to 1800 population boom, it's highly unlikely England would have industrialized at anywhere near the great scale and timeline it did in the early 19th century. To manufacture more goods in massive factories and to buy more manufactured goods, you have to have more consumers. England's population doubled between 1800 and 1850, doubled. To compare, in 1970, so 50 years ago, the US population was about 203 million, and in 2020 it was 330 million. So it grew by about 55% or 50%. If our population had doubled instead, we would have 406 million Americans instead of 330. 76 more million than we currently have. So we would need an additional California, Texas, and North Carolina. To bring it closer to home, Utah had more than 1 million residents in 1970 and has 3.25 now, or in 2020. So if you lived in Utah over that stretch, especially along the Wasatch Front, you have a really good sense of what it was like to live in massive population growth. We tripled in size, but England doubled, the whole nation. We often think of population growth and industrialization's impact on the cities and the manufacturing towns. But I want to use this map from the area where Rupert Woodruff preached in Western England to show how population growth impacted even places away from the major cities and not connected to the expanding rail system. You see that just blank space there between Bristol and Birmingham, Gloucester and on the line between them. That is the area he would have preached in. And these two maps of Cheltenham, Gloucestershire, which is about 10 miles north of the city of Gloucester, up the road from Gloucester. So Cheltenham in the 1770s is a market town. It also has a spa. It's kind of a little bit of Bath before Bath and a little bit of Bath after Bath kind of spa town in England. So we can see that's Cheltenham in the mid-19th century. It's the same road. And I tried my skills to see if I could make it blend over. Oh, it doesn't show up very well. So that little road becomes this, the same road. And this is not an industrial place. It shows how they experienced population growth and urban expansion. It touched much of the country, even if it did not have manufacturing sites. The population growth came from what demographers call the demographic transition, and this is a global transition. It starts in the mid-18th century. Before the mid-18th century, populations around the globe, not just England or Europe, experienced what we call boom-bust cycles. High birth rates, very high birth rates were often offset by very high death rates, meaning populations rarely sustained growth over centuries, as natural disasters, war, and primarily disease disease epidemics could decimate populations. In England, for example, it took 200 years for the population to recover its pre-Black Death population. After 1750, however, two things happened. Death rates dramatically declined, and following that, a bit later, birth rates declined. The consequence of this is sustained global population growth over nearly 3 centuries, a purely modern phenomenon. So what does this mean for folks in Western England in the early 1800s and into the 1830s and 40s? It means they often lived longer than previous generations, meaning increasing numbers of people had relationships with grandparents that really had not been on offer consistently for most people. They had grandparents, but not everyone could count on having grandparents for very long in their lives. Especially in England where people get married late. Oh, this is always one of my favorite topics. But this is a very educated audience, so probably won't go over as well. But how many of you think the average age for especially women was under age 20 before the 19th century? Or under age 25? No one thinks no one got married before 25. Yeah, this isn't over as well in a well-informed audience. Average age for marriage for women in England, since as far back as there are records, was mid-20s, let's say, and a couple years older for men. Women in other parts of the world get married a decade earlier, in the mid-teens to late teens, to men 10 years old. So it's a very different demographic situation in northwestern Europe, and England is part of that. So when so people aren't having babies until later, so it's hard for grandparents to be around when you don't have your first child until you're 26 or 7. And at any point, disease can ravage the population. So people are living longer, so they have longer relationships in their family. But the biggest difference was babies and children. The death rate that declined since the 1500s is infant and child mortality death. Demographers estimate that the majority of humanity before the 20th century died before the age of 15. The history of the world is the history of infant and child death. And pre-1800 England, about 10 to 15% of children did not live to their first birthday, and another 10 to 15% did not live to their 10th. To give you just one example, I'm going to show you the Sharp family, who you can tell was very well off. These are not the industrial laborers you would rather here. They may have had unusual levels of infertility, even for their generation. 8 of the 14 siblings made it to adulthood. But between them, they had only 3 nieces or daughters who themselves lived to adulthood. But their experience was common across classes in the 18th century. So I just have a sample from one part of this story. After 5 years of marriage, the sister Elizabeth, the woman at the pianoforte in the middle, was widowed. She was 34, had no children, and left no record of ever having been pregnant. Her oldest brother and his wife, down on the bottom right, yes, it's the same son, the man in the clerical wig and robes, and his wife, also first cousin, were married 10 years before having their first child, much longer than common experience of having a child within a year or 2 of marriage. At the time, Mary was 42, and that proved to be her last pregnancy. Another brother and sister-in-law, the man up top, oh no, this couple's not in them. Another brother and sister-in-law had a child within a year of their marriage, but the boy was premature, stillborn, and the sister-in-law died within a few hours of delivering him. Another brother's wife, Catherine, so if you see the man up top, looks kind of like George Washington. That's William, and wearing this Windsor suit. And below, the woman also wearing what looks like a similar style of military dress, that's his wife. Catherine was regularly pregnant, but she miscarried or gave birth to stillborn babies 18 to 20 times in the first 14 years of their marriage. In July 1773, Catherine experienced the birth of a son, and Elizabeth, who was the diarist in the family, noted that Catherine was safe in her bed, but with her usual ill luck, a fine child but stillborn. It's no wonder that the birth of Catherine's daughter, the little girl on her lap, in 1778 was celebrated by the entire family. Elizabeth was in attendance and noted that her brother and sister-in-law were blessed with a little girl, the only time of her success, that this great blessing was felt most thankfully by all. This meant, and by the way, everyone in this picture, only that little girl has living descendants. This meant that before the 19th century, most English households had relatively few children. And it wasn't just child death. Most English families sent their children, boys and girls, off to apprenticeships or to domestic service jobs in their mid-teens. So many households had their own small children, or a small cohort of children, and then young servants or apprentices who may or may not have been related to them. Industrialization repeated this pattern, though it often meant going into paid factory work, again for both boys and girls. Then it meant apprenticeships and skilled trades. I should point out here that the 1830s England Guildford encountered was still in transition between these systems, so you can find all of this if you look at different regions within England. Particularly the folks who joined the United Brethren and lived in the 3 western counties probably had much of the previous system in place, since they were not in industrial areas, and many of them came from skilled trades or from prosperous farms. Population growth was fueled by more children surviving childhood and going on to have children of their own. Simultaneously, women's age of first marriage dropped a bit, meaning women had perhaps 1 or 2 more children than the previous generations, and of course more of them survived. My great-great-grandmother I started with had 15 children, and 13 survived to adulthood. Simultaneously, the mobility and dislocations of industrialization brought increased numbers of illegitimacy, which more than doubled between 1750 and 1920. Though I want to point out, some of that increase has to do with how the records are kept, and not just the experience of extramarital birth. While industrialization expanded on previous manufacturing patterns, its scale was unprecedented in the impact it had on social, familial, and economic patterns. Industrial towns sprawled out to become massive industrial cities, packed with polluting factories, rapidly built slums, and seemingly endless rivers of migrants from villages in the countryside. Industrialization mechanized agricultural work and pushed traditional trades, particularly textiles, into factories. Old employment patterns, many based on personal relationships between apprentice and master's family, or between servant and family, were replaced with relationships solely based on the exchange of labor for a wage. Oops, there we go. I don't want to make those pre-industrial days seem like some sort of golden era. They were not. They had their own share of exploitation and injustice. But industrialization brought a scale of economic transformation across the country, one that exacerbated the difference between socioeconomic groups. So, for example, these are wages, industrial wages in Lancashire in 1830, and the National Archives of the UK gives you a nice little currency converter that doesn't just tell you how much money that's worth, but what it could buy you. So, a man in his mid-20s working in Lancashire in 1830 might earn 17 shillings 2 pence a week, and so in 2017 time, it gives you 58 pounds, but it's real buying powers that represents 4 days' work for a skilled tradesperson. So it gives you the relative. And for women, it was the equivalent of 2 days' skilled trade. While in general there was typical better access to food and manufactured goods, class differences often deepened and became entrenched. So that you have this experience in London slums and this lovely experience for a middle-class family. If we go back to the wage chart, you can see that a male laborer in industrial Lancashire, would make about 45 pounds in a year. By contrast, estimates for the minimum amount a gentleman would live on were more than 3 times that amount. And that would be a modest amount for the gentleman to live with 150 pounds a year. And of course, that doesn't account for the great disparity in male and female wages. So what about the people living in those 3 counties in the 1830s and 40s? What was life like for them? First, you should know it was and still is a beautiful part of the country. In fact, it's part of the country Americans imagine when they think of English villages. The Malvern Hills in this painting and the Cotswolds remain that postcard perfect area. This is a photo I took in my lifetime, so this is not imaginary. In those stone cottages or timbered homes, spaces were becoming increasingly privatized and specialized. Instead of all activities, working, manufacturing, sleeping, eating, cooking, socializing, caring for the ill, entertaining, occurred in one or maybe two rooms. Homes were being segregated for more privacy. They were also acquiring more consumer goods, furniture, decoration, dishes, which allowed for greater comfort and more ways to store, prepare, and present food, and which usually also meant more domestic labor to purchase, clean, maintain, and store all those goods. Pardon the London image here, but you can see the array of dishes in the bottom right, the on offer in any market of decent size. I want to show you this Tewkesbury, Gloucestershire, so further up the road from Gloucester and Dearhurst naturally, a market town, medieval market town. This is inventory from an estate agent auctioning off household goods when somebody died or moved. But they might auction off things like bellows, bed frames, bed linens, dishes, as well as equipment for animals and carriages. And this is a map aptly to show this. Most of these families came from prosperous farm villages or were skilled trades within those. My own ancestors were butchers and carpenters in those places. Many families had left for America by 1841, but to give you one example of the household that remained behind, I use the Anne and Samuel Roberts household. That you can see he's a basket maker. And this would have been a typical skilled trade in the area of those who joined the church. Samuel and Anne joined the church in 1840. Samuel was widowed later that year, and the two of them married in May 1841. In their first marriage, Anne was my great-great-great-grandmother. Hannah Mariah Beagles is her daughter, and Jane Beagles listed there as my great-great-grandaunt. So those Tewkesbury estate agent notebooks were actually Latter-day Saint converts auctioning things getting ready to come to Nauvoo. So here's Daniel Browitz. That was his list that you saw earlier. Daniel Browitz is so my great-great-grandfather's sister, so my great-great-aunt, married Daniel Browitz. Isaac Harris married Daniel Browitz. They often hosted Wilford Woodruff, but here in early 1840 they sold household goods. The Harris household was worth about 25 pounds, and the Browett household worth about 57 pounds. What they sold, not including what they kept, which represents about 2/3 of a year's salary. So these were not poor laborers in these three counties. Oops. Yes, okay. So in conclusion, much changed in the decades before Wilford Woodruff arrived in England. Even if this part of England was a little bit removed from the direct impact of industrialization, they had still experienced much change demographically, politically, socially, and personally. And then they had decided to repeatedly embrace new religions. They embraced new faith, a new church, and soon some of them, a new country.